Let's look at some of the things that can go wrong in contingent valuation studies. There's a number of criteria that you can use to evaluate empirical research. The first is phase validity. Does the study do what it intends to do? The example we just looked at was Stonehenge, or rather the study was about the roads around Stonehenge. But some of the answers that the researchers got suggested that respondents really were valuing Stonehenge rather than the roads around it. And that's, of course, an important thing to consider. Does the study actually measures what the researchers thinks it measures, or did the respondents have something else in mind? Criterion validity is another test. Do we actually follow best practice? Construct validity is important too. And there's two flavors of that, convergent and divergent validity. It's always good to measure the same thing in different ways, and then you would hope that your measures correlate with each other. And of course, it's also possible to measure its opposite, and then you should have negative correlation, or you can try and measure something that has nothing to do with it, and then you should find no correlation whatsoever. So that's always a good test. It's also always good to check whether the thing that you measured actually corresponds to theoretical predictions. If it does not, it may be because your measure is wrong, or it may be because your theory is wrong. But it's always good to make that test. And finally, you would want to measure the same thing a number of times to see whether you would win the same thing in the same way a number of times, and hoping that you would find the same, or at least roughly the same answer. The most important thing that goes wrong in contingent valuation studies is the non-commitment bias, or the hypothetical bias. And the problem here is very simple. You ask people what they would do were there a market for this particular good or service. There is no real skin in the game. There's no reality to it. You're asking people to respond to an imaginary thing, almost. And there's no real way around it, but you can try and mitigate it through a number of things. You can give respondents more time to think. This would solve the issue with the unfamiliarity of the question. It's not just that you're asking people about something that isn't real, that is hypothetical, but you're also asking particularly strange questions. How much would you contribute to saving whales? That's not an everyday question. So giving people time to think. Sometimes they even come back the next day for an answer. That helps people anchor their answers into their real preferences. So you can split an interview over 2 days, for instance. If it's a mail-in interview, you can give people ample time to respond. Another thing that helps is to run so-called cheap talk scripts. And here is an example. In order to alert the respondent to the potential bias that is there, to make sure that they really consider their answer, you can tell them something like follows. Studies have shown that people answering surveys such as this often say that they're willing to pay more than they would if the situation were real and this amount of money actually had to be handed over. What our yes vote really means is that we are basically good people and that we would like to see good things happen. That's cheap talk, right? But when the situation is real and we would actually have to spend our money, and we think in a different way. We basically still would like to see good things happen, but when we are faced with the possibility of having to spend money, We think about our options. If I spend money on this, that's money I don't have to, that I can't spend on other things. So while answering this next question, please think as if the situation we described were real and you would actually have to pay the amount of money stated. It doesn't solve the problem, but it alleviates the problem. It sort of prompts people, urges people not to give unthinking answers, and they do give unthinking answers. There's one beautiful example where they did a contingent valuation study of a particular castle, and they were waiting at the gate of the castle and interviewed people coming in and asked them, how much are you willing to pay as an entrance fee to visit this particular site? And from a distance it looked like quite an impressive castle. And people gave their answers. Some people said, well, this is worth £2 per person per visit, and other people say, oh, this is worth £5 per visit. And that was the answer they gave, and then the survey continued and they asked other questions: where are you from, and how old are you, and all that sort of stuff. And then at the end of the interview, they actually offered people entrance tickets at the price that people had just quoted. And somebody would have said, I'm willing to pay £5 to get in here. And then at the end of the interview, they said, look, here's a ticket. You can buy it from us for £5. And then almost 40% of respondents backed away and said, no, I don't want to pay that much. And some of that was genuine. Some of them actually said, I would pay that much, but not now, because I didn't realize how big this castle is and we won't have enough time this afternoon because we have other things to do, which is a reasonable answer. Where other people just blankly refused to pay the price that they had just quoted. So this hypothetical bias is real, and you can talk all you want. You can use a cheap talk script to urge people to really consider their answer, but that of course does not guarantee that they do, but it helps to mitigate this particular problem. There's all sorts of other biases that can happen. One is protest votes. There we are, protest votes, where people may simply object to the fact that they will have to pay for something. They might argue that it is free, or that it should be free. They might also protest against what they would consider a marketization of the environment. So they do care about the environmental good in question, but they just don't think it should be on the market. And there's nothing you can do against that except for measuring the reasons why people say zero. And this is maybe a bit more subtle than you think. Sometimes the protest is against the payment vehicle. And we've seen an example of that already, that people do care about these things, but they don't want to pay for it through taxation because they think taxes are already high enough, or because they think that the government is corrupt and would waste all that money or put it in a Swiss bank account. And that is a genuine reason to say no, I don't want to pay, or to say zero. But of course it does not mean that their true preference is zero. So you need to measure this to make sure that you somehow capture this. And sometimes people don't care about something and then they vote zero, and sometimes they vote zero for other reasons, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. If you use an open-ended question, how much are you willing to pay, without any sort of upper or lower bounds, then you may fall foul of strategic bias. Because some respondents will realize that you're actually not asking people to hand over money, but rather you're using this survey to influence policy, and you're going to take the average response of 1,000 people that you've interviewed, and you're going to take that average to convince a politician that they really should be spending this sort of money on protecting this park, for instance. And if you then use an open-ended question, that some people may realize, well, they're really going to take the average, they're not going to come after my money. They're going to take the average of my response with 1,000 others, and therefore, if I care about this particular part, then I would give a very high number, because that's the best way of cranking up the average. And that happens. The solution here is to use dichotomous or trichotomous choice, or a payment letter, where you anchor people's response from above and below, and you do not allow them to manipulate the results that strongly. Of course, if you use a payment letter, then they can still go for the top, right? But they can't give a very high number. Other problems that have emerged in contingent valuation studies are the so-called part-whole bias, or embedding, or scope insensitivity, which really is a clever way of saying that people can't count or do not care. And this came out of some of the studies that were done in the wake of Exxon Valdez, and particularly studies that were done on behalf of Exxon, or sponsored by Exxon, I should say, rather than on behalf of. Don't want to cast aspersions here. This was a study that was done in, I believe, Louisiana, and it was about protecting docks against oil contamination. So there's oil drilling there, and there were just ponds with oil in. Very little water and a lot of oil just at the surface, and then migratory ducks would get in there and get themselves all covered in oil and typically die as a result. And the solutions to that you can put nets over these oil ponds to make sure that the birds don't get in. And this particular study was split into, or the sample was split into 3 parts. And in one part of the study, people were asked, how much are you willing to pay for these particular measures? And they were told these measures would save on average 2,000 ducks per year. That was 1/3 of the sample. And another third of the sample was given the same scenario. We put nets over those oil ponds, and this would save around 20,000 ducks per year. And then the final third of the sample were given, again, the same question, but this time they would save 200,000 ducks per year. And lo and behold, there was no difference in the answer between the 3/3 of the sample. That is, everybody said $50 per year is what I'm prepared to pay. And that was regardless of the number of ducks that were saved. Now there's 2 alternative interpretations to this. And well, 3 interpretations, and the authors of this study gave the first one, namely that this is all a load of bollocks. Because you should be willing to pay more to save 20,000 ducks than to save 2,000 ducks, and you should be willing to pay more to save 200,000 ducks than 20,000 ducks, and definitely more for 200,000 ducks than for 2,000 ducks. And that is the part-whole bias, or the scope insensitivity. The size of the thing you're getting should determine your willingness to pay. You should be willing to pay more for 10 pints of milk than for 1 pint of milk. And definitely the supermarket would charge you more for that. So that is one interpretation. This is all a load of nonsense. The second interpretation is that people are not really responding to the question. People are not really engaging with the subject matter. But what they do really is they see this as a good cause. And at the beginning of the year, they may have decided that this year I'm going to set £500 aside for good causes, and last year 10 charities came knocking on my door, and therefore I'm going to give the first 10 charities that come asking for money this year, I'm going to give them £50. And that may be the decision model that people follow, where the good thing is that emotionally you're not really getting engaged, you don't get upset, you just give money, right? You don't get upset, you don't get engaged with the subject matter, therefore you don't get emotionally involved. You pay them £50 to just go away, so that you don't have to think about that. And if that is the way people approach giving to charity, then that is also the way people would respond to a survey about what is essentially about charity, giving money for a good cause, in this case saving dogs. And that immediately implies that people don't really think about what they're really doing, because any good cause is a good cause, and there's no real engagement with the nature of the cause. And this is typically known as warm glow, that what matters is the act of giving, that either may give you a warm feeling inside that you've been good, or sort of prevent negative feelings about not doing your bit for charity, right? So that is the second explanation. The third explanation is that people can't count, or that people can't be bothered to count. And 2,000 ducks is a lot of ducks, and 20,000 ducks is also a lot of ducks, but unless you're an expert in counting flocks of birds, you actually have a hard time telling apart 20,000 ducks from 2,000 ducks. And it may be that if it comes to ducks, people really count as 1, 2, 3, 6 many, and that's the number of ducks there can be, right? You can see the difference between 1 duck and 2 ducks and 3 ducks, and then there is an indeterminate small group, and then there's a large group of ducks, and that's it. And you can't be bothered to tell the difference between 17 ducks and 18 ducks. And that would also explain why people do not respond to the scope of the thing that is being tested. The way to counter this is just to test this, right? Just to have confront different parts of your sample with different questions. Temporal embedding is something similar, where sometimes they split the sample into 2 halves. One they ask for a contribution per month, and the other half they ask for a contribution per year, and often they find that the answer is 10, regardless of whether it's £10 per month or £10 per year, which again suggests that people are not really paying attention to the question. Similar things happen if you ask about small environmental problems versus large environmental problems. So obviously 20,000 ducks is a part of 200,000 ducks, but you can also ask about ducks and then other migratory birds and other aspects of environmental problems or problems in nature conservation, and then it turns out that regardless of whether you ask a part question or a more holistic question, you get the same results. And the way to counter that is again just test this in by asking people different parts of your sample different questions, or changing the order in which you ask questions. At first you ask one half of your sample, you first ask about ducks and then about all migratory birds, and the other half of your sample, you first ask about all migratory birds and then about ducks and see whether the results are different. Then at least you have identified the problem, you haven't necessarily solved it. In some of the payment vehicles, like a payment ladder, you have an upper bound and a lower bound, and it's trichotomous choice. Are you willing to pay £10? If yes, are you also willing to pay £15? Or if no, are you prepared to pay £5? There, the starting point matters, and it matters in two ways. Some people wouldn't have a clue and therefore pick the middle, or some people think that they are past and therefore always go for the higher number that is presented to them, and so on and so forth. These anchors actually matter, and if you do trichotomous choice, or you go for 4 options or 5 options, then it of course may be that people get fed up, right? So if the sequence is, are you prepared to pay £10? And you say no, and then they come back with a question, are you prepared to pay £9? And you say no, and then they come back with a question, are you prepared to pay £8? And then you say no, and then they come back with a question, are you prepared to pay £7? And even if you're not prepared to pay £7, you may be completely fed up with the interviewer at that particular point, and just say yes to make him go or her go away, right? So those things happen. The way to weapon against yourself that is to try different variants in different parts of your sample, so that you acknowledge the problem at least, and maybe you have enough evidence there to figure out what is the effect of the anchor or the starting point on your final valuation, right, through an exposed regression analysis of your results. There may be interviewer bias, and this happens more often than you might think. We once did a study with a group of students as essentially their seminar contribution, that they would set up a survey to value water quality in Hamburg, and they interviewed loads and loads of people, and came back and they asked all sorts of demographics, and then they ran regressions of their willingness to pay to improve water quality so that this particular lake would become swimmable again. And it turned out that in the regression, the only explanatory variable that was significant was the interviewer dummy. So what we found was that some of the students that did the interview got higher numbers than other students. But not that older people would be willing to pay more, or richer people would be willing to pay more, or females would be willing to pay more. No, it all depended on the interviewer and the interviewer only. And this, you can imagine, if you're doing face-to-face interviews, if somebody walks up to you in the street to ask you a question about your willingness to pay to help preserve the whale population in the North Atlantic, if that person is pleasant, you would give a different answer than if that person is rude and has a smelly breath, for instance. And those things matter, right? You may respond to the interviewer, and it may be that the interviewer is a pretty girl and the interviewee is one of those silly males who thinks, well, she's here to interview me about whales, so that obviously means that she cares about whales. Realizing perhaps he's doing this to make some money on the side. No, it must be because he's interested in this, and let's try and impress her by giving a very high number, right? Those things happen. They also happen that the interviewer actually goes wrong. A good friend of mine did surveys to help pay her way through college, an awfully nice girl, and the subject that he was interviewing people about was the numeracy of first-generation immigrants in the Netherlands. And he essentially had to go to people's houses and let them do simple math problems. Yeah, and as I said, she was a very good girl and a very nice person. And she felt sorry for them, for some of them, and helped them with the answers, right? It is exactly not what you want. But these things happen. Again, you can test for it, and you can train your interviewers not to do these things. And you can try and make your interviewers to be an homogeneous population. You immediately run into all sorts of discrimination issues there. But yeah, you can at least acknowledge it. The example that I just gave, that if a pretty girl walks up to you and asks about your willingness to pay to help preserve whales, may induce yay-saying. Some people are simply, some people just say yes to questions, particularly questions from some people, and that's called yay-saying, that this is social conformity. The other person in the interview cares about these things, and therefore I must pretend to care as well. And of course, there's also a group of people who are naysayers, right? Who just want to do the opposite thing. Problem with contingent valuation studies or any service of any kind is that you talk about a problem and therefore you put this problem more prominently in people's minds. And that immediately implies that the people you interview are no longer representative of the population as a whole, because you've just alerted them to this particular problem. Also, you often give them information about the problem. You describe the environmental issues that are going on. You describe, even if you do it in neutral terms, the problems that there are. And that means that in terms of what your interviewees know about the problem is different than what the general population knows about the problem. And that means that they're no longer representative. And there have indeed been studies where people made up the species and said they are going extinct, and how much are you willing to pay to preserve this? And people gave an answer. And there's even one study, I believe, done in Iceland or Norway, it escapes me at the moment, where they asked about people's willingness to pay to help preserve trolls, which, I hope it's not a surprise to you, are completely fictional, right? And then, of course, another issue with representativeness of your sample is that the people who do not respond may be structurally different than the people who do respond. Some people may simply walk away from surveys. Some people walk away from any survey, and some people walk away from surveys about particular topics. And there's very little you can do. I mean, you can compare your sample, the measurable characteristics, against the measurable characteristics of your entire population. But if it's something that is unobservable, you have a problem. All these problems are real, and it is therefore important to be wary of contingent valuation if you're applying it, or if you're using it, or if you're interpreting the results. If you design your study carefully, then you can overcome many of these issues, or at least measure the influence of these issues on your answers. But because there are so many problems, that makes for a very complicated survey design. And the problem with complicated survey designs is that you may then lose some of your respondents. But, for telephone surveys, if you can keep people on the telephone for 10 minutes, you're lucky. Online surveys, similar, they have to be short and sharp. And then it works. And the problem is that if they have to be short, there's only so much you can do. Face-to-face interviews, you can make longer, but of course face-to-face interviews you tend to target those people who have time on their hands and who are positively inclined to doing this sort of thing in the first place. All these problems are studied, they are known, there are ways around it, and contingent valuation therefore remains an essential tool for environmental economics, particularly if you are trying to value non-use values. And that may be to advise policy, or that may be to advise courts about compensation that needs to be paid or damages that need to be imposed. But these non-use values are real, and contingent valuation, or state preference methods I should say, are the only way to get a handle on the size of the value of these issues.